Welcome back to Silent Revenge Lab, the best channel for revenge stories.
They say the soul has a memory for cold. Even now, 15 years later, I can still feel the biting February wind seeping through my thin denim jacket as I watched my father's taillights fade into the gray horizon. No hug, no explanation. Just a suitcase with a broken zipper and a muffled good luck before the car door slammed. My name is Cassandra Vance. I'm 28 years old, and today I'm a senior partner at one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the city. But to the two people sitting across from me in this mahogany-paneled law office, I'm just a ghost they thought they'd buried over a decade ago. The air in the room is thick with the scent of old paper and expensive cologne. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, are dressed in their Sunday best, which for them means clothes they clearly can't afford anymore, clinging to the facade of the upper-middle-class life they once valued more than their own flesh and blood. They haven't looked at me once, not a glance. Their eyes are fixed on the heavy cream-colored envelope resting on the desk of Mr. Sterling, the executor of my Uncle Julian's estate. Uncle Julian was the man who found me shivering on his porch that cold February night.
He was the man who taught me that family isn't about DNA.
It's about who stays when everyone else runs. Richard is tapping his foot, a nervous habit I remember from my childhood, usually right before he'd blame me for a missed promotion or a high credit card bill. Evelyn is clutching her designer knockoff purse so hard her knuckles are white. They think they're here for a payday. They think Julian's passing is their get-out-of-debt-free card. They have no idea that the man they called a penniless hermit died with a secret that is about to dismantle their entire world. Hold on, before we get into the real stuff, I want to know. What are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments. Are you folding laundry, commuting? Let me know, because what I'm about to tell you next requires your full attention. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gavel in the silent room. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me, not them, with a look of profound pity and hidden triumph. We are here, he began, his voice gravelly and slow, to honor the final wishes of Julian Vance, per his instructions. This meeting was only to take place in the presence of his legal heirs and his ward.
Cassandra, Evelyn let out a sharp, theatrical sigh. Can we skip the pleasantries, Marcus?
We've had a very long drive, and we have obligations to attend to. Just read the figures. She still called me the ward, not daughter, not Cassie. It was as if by refusing to use my name, she could erase the guilt of what she did. But you can't erase a debt that's been accruing interest for 15 years. Mr. Sterling didn't flinch. He broke the wax seal on the envelope. The sound of tearing paper seemed to scream in the quiet room. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, but as he began to read the introductory clauses, his brow furrowed. He stopped, looked at my parents, then back at the document. Is there a problem? Richard asked, his voice leaning forward, hungry. The estate is valued at $4 million, correct? That's what the preliminary notice suggested. The estate, Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, is actually valued at closer to $6 million, including the offshore holdings and the deed to the lakeside property. My mother's face lit up. A predatory, terrifying smile spread across her lips. She actually reached out her hand as if the money was already being placed into her palm. But then Mr. Sterling turned to page 2.
He reached the section regarding the conditions of transfer. As he read the first sentence of Clause 9, the color drained from my mother's face, so fast I thought she might faint.
She didn't just stop smiling, her jaw literally dropped, and she let out a strangled, breathless sound. Richard surged forward, nearly knocking over a crystal water carafe. That's impossible, he roared. He wouldn't do that. He was my brother? Mr. Sterling looked him dead in the eye. He was your brother, but he was her father. And according to this, you aren't getting a cent unless... Cassandra signs a very specific document. The look my mother gave me in that moment wasn't one of regret. It was pure, unadulterated venom. And that's when I realized the revenge I had dreamed of for 15 years wasn't just coming. It was already here. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it's ringing in your ears. My father's hand was still hovering over the mahogany desk, trembling with a mix of greed and sudden cold terror. He looked at Mr. Sterling, then slowly, like a rusted hinge, he turned his head toward me. For the first time in 15 years, he actually saw me. But he didn't see the daughter he'd abandoned. He saw a gatekeeper standing between him and $6 million. What do you mean, unless she signs? Richard's voice was a jagged rasp. I'm his next of kin. That money belongs to the Vance bloodline. She was just a guest in his house. Mr. Sterling didn't even blink. He slid a heavy gold-embossed folder across the table toward me, ignoring my father entirely. Actually, Richard, Julian legally adopted Cassandra exactly 3 days after you left her on his doorstep. In the eyes of the law, she isn't a ward. She is his sole daughter and his primary heir. However, he paused, letting the word hang in the air like a guillotine blade. Julian was a man who believed in a very specific type of justice. He knew you'd come sniffing around the moment he passed. My mother, Evelyn, finally found her voice, though it sounded thin and hysterical. This is a setup. Julian was always eccentric, always trying to make us look bad just because we made a difficult parenting decision. We had no choice. We were in debt. The business was failing. We did what was best for her. I felt a cold laugh bubble up in my chest. What was best for me? A 13-year-old girl standing in a blizzard with nothing but a suitcase of outgrown clothes and a teddy bear with a missing eye. I didn't say a word. I just watched her. I wanted her to feel the weight of my silence. I wanted her to realize that the little girl who used to beg for her approval was dead, replaced by the woman who now held her entire future in a fountain pen.
Clause 9, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice cutting through my mother's screeching,
states that the entirety of the $6 million estate, the real estate, the investment portfolios, and the offshore accounts is to be held in a blind trust. Richard and Evelyn Vance are to be granted a monthly stipend of $15,000 for the remainder of their lives. My father's eyes widened. $15,000? Monthly? That's enough. We can work with that. He let out a breath of relief, his shoulders slumping. He even dared to give me a small, patronizing nod, as if to say, see. Everything worked out. But Mr. Sterling wasn't finished. The stipend is granted only on the condition that Cassandra Vance signs a certificate of forgiveness and a release of liability every single month. If she refuses to sign for any reason or no reason at all, the funds for that month are instead donated to the local foster care system where Julian served as a board member. And if she refuses to sign for 3 consecutive months, the entire estate is liquidated and gifted to charity, leaving the primary relatives with nothing. The blood didn't just leave my mother's face this time. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hand went to her throat, her chest heaving. She has to approve our money? Every month? Precisely, Mr. Sterling said, leaning back. Julian called it the Accountability Act. He wanted to ensure that for the rest of your lives, your comfort was entirely dependent on the mercy of the child you threw away. I looked down at the folder. Inside was the first month's release form. It was a simple piece of paper, but in this room, it was a weapon. I could feel my father's eyes burning into the side of my head. I could smell the desperation radiating off him like a foul scent. Cassie, honey, Richard said, his voice suddenly dripping with a fake, oily warmth that made my skin crawl. We don't need to be dramatic about this, do we? We're family. We made mistakes, sure, but look at you, you're successful. You're a partner at a firm. You don't need this money, but your mother and we're in a bad way. The house is in foreclosure. Our creditors they aren't patient people. I finally looked at him. I stared into his eyes until he looked away. You called me a guest 2 minutes ago, Richard, I said, my voice steady and low. And 15 years ago, you called me a burden. Funny how the vocabulary changes when there's a check on the line. Don't be cruel, Cassandra. Evelyn snapped, her true colors leaking through her mask of grief. You have no idea what we went through. We suffered too. You suffered in a heated house with a full fridge, I countered. I learned how to survive on Julian's porch. I picked up the pen. The nib hovered just millimeters above the signature line. I could see my father's pupils dilate. He was leaning so far over the table he was practically hovering over the document. If I signed, they stayed afloat. If I didn't, they'd be on the street by the end of the week. I looked at Mr. Sterling. What happens if I sign this first one, but I decide I don't like their attitude next month? Then they get nothing next month, Sterling replied with a thin, professional smile. You are the judge, the jury, and the bank, Cassandra. I saw my mother's hand shake as she reached for her water. She knew that the power dynamic had flipped so violently that the room felt tilted. But then Richard did something that changed the entire energy of the meeting. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowing piece of paper. Before you decide not to sign, Cassie, he whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of threat. You might want to read this. It's a letter Julian wrote to us a year ago. It's about why we really left you there. And if you don't sign that paper right now, I'll make sure the board of your architecture firm sees exactly what kind of scandal your family was running before Julian took you in. My heart skipped a beat. A letter? Julian never mentioned a letter. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it turned lethal. My hand, still holding the expensive fountain pen, froze mid-air. I looked at the yellowed scrap of paper in my father's hand. It looked fragile, like it might crumble if the wind caught it, yet it felt heavier than the $6 million estate sitting on the table. A scandal? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. My mind raced through every memory I had of Uncle Julian.
He was a pillar of the community.
A man of quiet integrity who spent his weekends volunteering at the local shelter and his evenings teaching me how to draft blueprints. The idea of him harboring a secret dark enough to ruin my career felt like a physical blow to the chest. Richard leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, sickly triumph.
He saw the flicker of doubt in my eyes and he fed on it. You think Julian was a saint, don't you?
You think he took you in out of the goodness of his heart. But Julian had debts, too, Cassandra. Debts that weren't paid in money. If your firm, those high and mighty partners who value reputation above all else, knew the truth about where Julian's initial seed money for his investments came from, well, let's just say your senior partner title would vanish faster than we did 15 years ago. My mother, Evelyn, sat up straighter, her face regaining its color as she saw the leverage shift. We only want what's fair, honey, she cooed, the word honey sounding like a slur. Sign the paper. Give us the first month's stipend, and let's put this accountability nonsense behind us. We can be a family again. A quiet, wealthy family. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He remained impassive, but I noticed his grip tighten on his leather-bound ledger. Is this true, Marcus? I asked. Did Julian leave a letter like this? Mr. Sterling sighed, a sound of genuine regret. Julian was a complex man, Cassandra. He lived a long life before you arrived on his porch. There are aspects of his early business ventures that were, shall we say, legally gray. But he spent 15 years making amends for those choices by raising you. Gray? Richard scoffed. It was black as coal, and you know it. Now, Cassie, the pen is in your hand. Sign the release for the $15,000, and this letter stays in my pocket. If you don't, I've already got the email address for your firm's ethics committee pulled up on my phone. This was the man who raised me for 13 years. This was the man who was supposed to protect me. And here he was, using the memory of the only person who actually loved me as a weapon of extortion. My stomach churned with a nausea so deep I thought I might be sick right there on the Persian rug. I looked down at the signature line. My name, Cassandra Vance, looked back at me. If I signed, I was officially their ATM. I would be tethered to their greed for the rest of their lives, buying their silence every 30 days. I'd be a slave to a ghost's secret. But if I didn't sign, my career, the one thing I had built from the ground up through sleepless nights and grueling exams, could be incinerated in an afternoon. In the world of high-end architecture, your name is your currency. If it's tarnished, you're finished. I felt the weight of 15 years of abandonment crashing down on me. They didn't just leave me at 13. They were trying to bury me at 28. I took a deep breath, the scent of the old office filling my lungs. I looked at Richard's smug face, and then at the letter. My fingers tightened around the pen. You want the money that badly? I asked, my voice suddenly devoid of all emotion. We need it, Cassie, Richard said, trying to soften his tone, but failing to hide the hunger in his eyes. I lowered the pen to the paper. I began to write the first letter of my name. Evelyn let out a tiny, suppressed gasp of excitement. Richard's eyes were locked on the tip of the pen. But as I reached the end of my first name, I stopped. I looked up at them and a slow, cold realization dawned on me. Julian wasn't just a smart businessman, he was a master strategist. He knew my parents better than I did.
He knew they'd try to blackmail me. Wait, I said, pulling the paper back toward me.
Mr. Sterling, you said the trust is blind, correct? And that I have the power to refuse the signature for any reason. That is correct, Sterling said. And what happens? I asked, my eyes boring into my father's. If the reason I refuse to sign is because the beneficiaries are currently attempting to commit a felony specifically, third-degree extortion? The color didn't just drain from Richard's face this time. He physically recoiled as if I'd slapped him. I'm not extorting you, he stammered. I'm just sharing information. You just threatened my career in front of a licensed attorney who is also the executor of this estate, I said, my voice rising in power. Marcus, does the trust have a clause regarding the legal conduct of the beneficiaries? Mr. Sterling's lips curled into a very small, very dangerous smile. He flipped to the very last page of the document, a page he hadn't read yet.
Actually, Cassandra, Julian anticipated this exact scenario.
He called it the Judas Clause. My parents froze. The Judas Clause?
It states, Sterling read aloud, that should Richard or Evelyn Vance attempt to use any information, past or present, to coerce, threaten, or blackmail the trustee, that's you, Cassandra, their right to any and all stipends is immediately and irrevocably terminated. Furthermore, the estate will then fund a private investigation into the very secrets they tried to use, ensuring the truth is brought to light on our terms, not theirs. Richard's hand shook so violently the letter fell onto the desk. I reached out and picked it up. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I looked at the man who called himself my father and the woman who birthed me, and for the first time in 15 years I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, just clarity. I'm not signing the release this month, I said, my voice as cold as the February wind. Cassie, please. Evelyn wailed, falling to her knees. We have nothing. The creditors. They'll take everything. Then I guess you'll learn what I learned at 13, I said, standing up. The world is a very cold place when you have no one to catch you. I turned to leave. But as my hand touched the brass doorknob, Richard screamed out one last thing, a detail that made me stop dead in my tracks. You think you're so smart, Cassandra? You think Julian loved you? Open the letter. Look at the date. Look at the date on that letter and tell me who really left you on that porch. The brass doorknob felt like ice under my palm. My father's voice wasn't just desperate anymore. It was venomous, a final jagged glass shard thrown at my back. I slowly turned around. Richard was panting, his face a mottled shade of purple, pointing a trembling finger at the yellowed envelope now resting in my hand. The date, Cassandra, he spat. Look at the blasted date. I looked down. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slowly unfolded the paper. The ink was faded, a watery blue that spoke of years spent tucked away in a dark drawer. I scanned the top right corner. February 10th, my breath hitched. February 10th was my 13th birthday. But that wasn't the part that made the room spin. It was the year. The year was 15 years ago, exactly 4 days before I was left on Julian's porch. I began to read, my eyes blurring as the words jumped off the page. Richard, as we discussed, the arrangements are finalized. The transition must happen under the cover of the storm to ensure no neighbors see. I have the payment ready for you and Evelyn. Once she is on my porch, you are to leave the state immediately. Do not contact her. Do not look back. This is the price for your silence regarding the warehouse fire. I felt the floor drop out from under me, the payment. I looked at my parents. My mother was staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. My father was leaning against the bookshelf, a sick, twisted smirk of, if I'm going down, you're coming with me, plastered on his face. You didn't just leave me, I whispered, the realization cutting deeper than any abandonment ever could. You sold me. He offered us a way out, Cassie. Evelyn suddenly shrieked, her voice cracking. We were going to lose everything because of that fire. Julian knew the authorities were looking at Richard.
He said he'd take care of the legal fees and give us enough to start over in Arizona, but only if he got guardianship. He wanted a legacy.
He wanted a daughter he could mold because he never had his own. The man I called my savior, the man who I thought had rescued me from the cruelty of my parents, had actually orchestrated my trauma. He had bought me like a piece of property, using my parents' desperation to satisfy his own loneliness. My entire life, my education, my career, my very identity was built on a transaction. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He looked away, his silence confirming the ugly truth. He had known. He had been the one to draw up those original dark papers. So you see, Richard said, stepping forward, his voice regaining its oily confidence. We aren't the only villains here. Julian was the one who pulled the strings. He stole you from us. We were just victims of his manipulation. Now, give us the money and we can all move on from this unfortunate history. I looked at the letter, then at the man who had traded his daughter for a clean slate and a check. Then I looked at the Judas Clause, document still sitting on the desk. The betrayal was total. My parents had sold me and my hero had purchased me. I was a senior partner at a top firm, a woman who designed skyscrapers that touched the clouds, and yet I felt smaller than that 13-year-old girl in the thin denim jacket. But then a cold, hard spark ignited in the center of my chest. They thought this revelation would break me. They thought it would make me crawl back to them, seeking some shred of real family. They thought that by tarnishing Julian's memory, they could guilt-trip me into opening the vault. They forgot one thing. Julian didn't just teach me how to draw blueprints. He taught me how to find the structural weakness in any foundation. And I just found theirs? You're right, Richard, I said, my voice eerily calm. Julian was a manipulator. He was a man who bought what he wanted. And clearly, he bought the best education money could provide. I walked back to the desk. I picked up the pen again. What are you doing? Evelyn asked, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. I'm rewriting the narrative, I said. I didn't sign the release form. Instead, I turned to the back of the document, where the trustee's discretionary powers were listed. I looked at Mr. Sterling. Marcus, as the trustee, I have the right to liquidate assets to cover unforeseen legal liabilities involving the estate, correct? Yes, Sterling said, looking intrigued. Good, because I'm calling the police. I'm reporting a 15-year-old case of human trafficking and extortion. And since Julian is dead, guess who the only living participants are? My father's face went from purple to a ghostly, translucent white. You wouldn't. You'd ruin your own name. The scandal will be about a brave woman who survived a horrific crime and brought her traffickers to justice, I snapped. The Vance name is already dead to me. From today on, I'm using my middle name. But you're going to be famous for all the wrong reasons. I picked up my phone and dialed 3 digits. I didn't press call yet. I held the screen up so they could see the numbers. Now, I said, leaning in until I was inches from my father's nose. You have exactly 60 seconds to give me the keys to the lakeside property. Sign over the title to your car and tell me the name of the man who actually started that warehouse fire. If you don't, I press call, and the Judas Clause triggers a full investigation that will land you in a cell before the sun sets. Richard looked at the phone. He looked at my eyes. He realized too late that he hadn't raised a victim. He had helped create a shark. I can't, he stammered. 55 seconds, I said. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the office sounded like a countdown to an explosion. Richard was hyperventilating, his eyes darting toward the door as if he could outrun a 15-year-old crime. Evelyn had sunk back into her chair, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. They weren't looking at a daughter anymore. They were looking at a predator who knew exactly where to bite. 40 seconds, I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. The car keys, the deed, and the name. Now. Cassie, please, we don't even have a place to go if we give you the lake house. Evelyn wailed. That property is the only thing we have left to our names. We've been living in a motel for 3 weeks. Then I suggest you get used to the decor, I replied. 30 seconds. If I press this green button, Marcus here is legally obligated to turn over all evidence of the Judas Clause and the warehouse fire documents to the district attorney. You won't just be homeless. You'll be wearing orange. Richard's hand dove into his pocket with such desperation he nearly ripped the fabric. He slammed a heavy brass key ring onto the mahogany desk. There The keys to the lake house. And the car is the black sedan in the lot. It's a lease to own, but the title is in the glove box. And the name? I asked, not moving an inch. Who started the fire? Richard looked at Mr. Sterling, then back at me. His voice was a terrified whisper. It wasn't a who, Cassie. It was an insurance job. Julian didn't just pay for our silence. He provided the accelerant. He wanted that land for his firm's development project, and our warehouse was in the way. He told us if we let it burn, he'd take care of our debts and give us a fresh start, but then he changed the price.
He said the price wasn't just the land anymore. The price
Was you. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The betrayal was a double-edged sword. My savior hadn't just bought me. He had burned down my parents' lives to create the opportunity to buy me. It was a perfectly designed trap. Julian Vance hadn't been an architect of buildings. He had been an architect of people's fates. 20 seconds, I reminded him, though the fire of my anger was now being replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. The name of the man who handled the paperwork for the insurance claim, the one who made it all look like an electrical fault. It was a man named Silas Thorne, Richard blurted out.
He was Julian's right-hand man for 20 years?
He's the one who has the original files. He's the one you should be after. I looked at Mr. Sterling. The attorney's face remained a mask of professional indifference, but I saw his eyes flicker at the mention of Silas Thorne. Marcus, I said, finally lowering the phone but keeping my finger near the screen. Is Silas Thorne still on the firm's payroll? Mr. Thorne retired 3 years ago, Sterling said carefully. However, he still maintains a private consultancy.
He is a very difficult man to reach.
Not for me, I said. I picked up the keys from the desk. I looked at my parents. You have 1 hour to vacate the lake house. I'm sending a private security team there. If you're still on the property when they arrive, they will treat you as trespassers. And as for the car, you're walking back to your motel. You can't do this. Richard yelled, his cowardice finally turning back into rage. We're your parents. We gave you life. You gave me a price tag, I shot back. And today the bill came due. I turned to Mr. Sterling. Keep the Judas Clause active. No stipends, no mercy. If they so much as breathe in my direction, call the DA. I'm going to find Silas Thorne. As I walked out of the office, I could hear my mother's sobbing and my father's muffled curses echoing through the heavy doors. I stepped out into the hallway, the bright fluorescent lights stinging my eyes. For 15 years, I thought I knew who I was. Now I was a stranger to myself, a woman built on a foundation of ash and lies. But as I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed.
It was an unknown number. I swiped to answer. Hello?
Cassandra, a deep, raspy voice said on the other end. I saw you leave the office. You have the keys, but you don't have the truth. Not all of it. If you want to know what Julian really intended for you, meet me at the old warehouse site in 20 minutes. Bring the letter. The line went dead. I looked at the phone, then at the elevator doors, reflecting my own hardened expression. The revenge I thought I wanted, the simple act of leaving my parents in the dirt, suddenly felt small. There was a larger game being played, and I was the only piece on the board that didn't know the rules. I didn't head for my car. I headed for the stairs. I needed to move. I needed to think. Because if Silas Thorne was waiting for me, it meant the fire that started 15 years ago hadn't been extinguished. It was just waiting for a fresh gust of wind. The drive to the old industrial district felt like descending into a graveyard of rusted steel and broken dreams. This was the place where my life had been bartered away. The warehouse was nothing more than a scorched concrete slab now, surrounded by a chain-link fence that hummed in the wind. Standing in the center of that desolate space was a man who looked like he was carved from granite. Silas Thorne. He was older than I expected, with hair the color of industrial smoke and eyes that seemed to see right through my expensive tailored coat. He didn't offer a handshake. He just gestured to the blackened ground beneath our feet. Do you know what stood right here, Cassandra?
He asked, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together.
My father's business, I said, my voice cold. The place Julian burned down to buy me. Silas let out a dry, hacking laugh. Is that what Richard told you? That Julian was the arsonist? He shook his head slowly. Julian Vance was many things, a manipulator. a strategist, a shark, but he wasn't a fool. He didn't burn this place down to get you. He burned it down to save you. I felt a jolt of static go through my nerves. Save me? From what? He paid my parents to abandon me.
He paid them to leave, Silas corrected, stepping closer.
Richard Vance didn't just have debt, Cassandra. He was involved with people who make Julian look like a choir boy. He had gambled away money that wasn't his money belonging to a syndicate that doesn't accept apologies. They were coming for the debt, and in their world, a 13-year-old daughter is a very valuable asset. The air felt thin. I thought of my father's shifting eyes, his oily desperation. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian didn't create the danger. He exploited it. He saw a child in the path of a tidal wave and offered the parents a life raft on the condition that he got to keep the child. Julian knew your parents would sell you to the highest bidder eventually, Silas continued, reaching into a weathered briefcase. He just made sure he was the one holding the checkbook. He spent the next 15 years building a fortress around you. Your education, your firm, your reputation, it was all designed to make you untouchable so that when the syndicate finally came looking, you'd be too powerful to disappear. He handed me a thick, leather-bound ledger. This isn't the estate's accounting. This is Julian's private log. Every bribe he paid to keep your name out of the police reports. Every investigator he hired to watch your parents in Arizona. And most importantly, the list of the men your father still owes. I opened the ledger. My heart stopped. There, on the first page, was a list of names. And at the bottom, a note in Julian's precise, architectural script. She is the masterpiece. The foundation must be protected at all costs. If Richard returns, the Judas Clause is the final wall. Let him destroy himself so she doesn't have to. I looked up at Silas, my eyes stinging. Why tell me this now? Why let me believe he was a monster? Because the final wall has been breached, Silas said, his expression turning grim. Your parents didn't come back just for the money, Cassandra. They came because the people they owe found them. They told your parents that if they could get access to Julian's offshore accounts through you, their debt would be wiped clean. A chill more profound than the winter wind swept over me. My parents weren't just begging at my door. They were leading the wolves straight to it. They had used the secret of the fire to distract me, to make me emotional and vulnerable, while they worked to gain control of the trust. They're at the lake house right now, aren't they? I whispered, looking at the brass keys in my hand. They are, Silas said, but they aren't alone. And if you don't sign that release form by midnight, the trust remains locked. Those men won't be patient. They'll realize Richard lied about his influence over you, and they'll take their payment in blood. I looked at the keys, then back at the blackened concrete. My parents had sold me once to save their skins. Now, 15 years later, they were trying to use me as a human shield again. They wanted my signature to pay off their gambling debts to monsters. A slow, dark smile began to form on my face. It wasn't the smile of a victim. It was the smile of the woman Julian Vance had built, the senior partner who knew how to design a structure that could withstand any pressure. Silas, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. How fast can you get a message to these creditors? Why? Silas asked, his eyebrows rising. Because my parents told them I'm the key to the vault, I said, clutching the ledger to my chest. I want to show them that the vault doesn't just hold money. It holds consequences. If they want to get paid, they're going to have to help me finish what Julian started. You're going to negotiate with them? Silas sounded almost impressed. No, I said, heading for my car. I'm going to subcontract them. My parents want to act like they're part of a story about family and forgiveness? Fine, let's give them a finale they'll never forget. As I sped toward the lake house, the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold. My parents thought they were the ones playing me. They thought they had a secret that could break me. But they forgot the most important rule of architecture. The most beautiful buildings are often the ones built over the deepest, darkest basements. I pulled up to the gates of the lakeside property. The lights were on. I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. I reached into my bag and pulled out the fountain pen and the unsigned release form. It was time to sign. But not for the reason they thought. The lake house was a masterpiece of glass and cedar, perched on the edge of a dark, mirror-like expanse of water. Julian had designed it as a sanctuary, a place where the world couldn't reach us. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw 3 black SUVs parked haphazardly across the lawn. The sanctuary had been breached. I sat in my car for a moment, the engine idling. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. 15 years ago, I was a girl who was pushed out of a car. Today I was the woman driving it. I reached into my glove box and pulled out a secondary phone one Julian had given me years ago, telling me to use it only if the foundations ever shook. I sent a single text to Silas Thorne. The vultures are in the nest. Initiate the audit. I stepped out of the car. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. As I walked toward the front door, the heavy oak entrance swung open before I could even reach for the handle. My father stood there, but he looked different. The smugness was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. His shirt was untucked, and there was a dark bruise forming along his jawline. Behind him, in the shadows of the foyer, stood 2 men in sharp charcoal suits. They didn't look like debt collectors. They looked like corporate executioners.
Cassie, thank God, Richard gasped, his voice cracking.
You brought the papers? You brought the release? I brought something better, Richard, I said, stepping past him into the house. I didn't look at him. I looked at the men in the suits. I brought a business proposition. My mother was sitting on the sofa in the great room, her face buried in her hands. Sitting across from her was a man with silver hair and a silk tie, sipping a glass of Julian's vintage scotch. He looked up at me with a predatory curiosity. So this is the masterpiece, the man said, his voice smooth as oil. I'm Victor. Your parents have told me a great deal about your reluctance to help the family. My parents are many things, Victor, but truthful isn't one of them, I said, tossing the unsigned release form onto the coffee table. They told you I have the power to unlock Julian's offshore accounts. What they didn't tell you is that those accounts are protected by a triple-factor legal firewall. My signature alone doesn't release the money. It only triggers a notice of intent. Victor narrowed his eyes. Richard stepped forward, his voice a pathetic whine. That's not what the lawyer said. You said you were the trustee. I am the trustee, I snapped, turning on him. Which means I am the only one who knows that the moment those funds are touched by anyone other than a Vance, a silent alarm goes to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Julian didn't just hide the money. He booby-trapped it. The room went deathly silent. My mother looked up, her eyes wide with terror. Victor set his glass down on the table with a soft clink. Are you telling me, Victor said quietly, that these 2 idiots have been wasting my time? Worse, I said, leaning against the fireplace mantel. They've been using you as leverage to try and scare me into a federal prison sentence. If I sign that paper the way they want, I go down for money laundering. And you? You get nothing but a massive investigation into your organization's assets. Richard's face turned a ghostly shade of gray. She's lying. She's just trying to save the money for herself. Check the ledger, Victor, I said, gesturing to the book I had brought from Silas. Julian kept records of every cent Richard borrowed from your associates 15 years ago. He didn't just pay it off, he bought the debt. Technically, Victor, your organization doesn't own Richard. The Vance estate owns his debt. And as the trustee, I am now your primary creditor. The shift in the room was tectonic. The 2 men by the door moved closer, but not toward me. They moved toward my father. You told me you had a way in, Victor whispered to Richard, his voice vibrating with a new, dangerous edge. You told me the girl was a pushover. Richard stammered, backing away until he hit the floor-to-ceiling glass window.
Here's the deal, Victor, I said, stepping into the center of the room. I'm going to sign a release.
But it's not for the $15,000. It's for the full amount of the debt my father owes you plus 20% for your inconvenience. But that money doesn't come from the trust. It comes from the liquidation of my parents' remaining assets, including the very car they drove here and the life insurance policies Julian secretly maintained in their names. You can't do that, Evelyn screamed, standing up. That's our only security. You traded your security when you tried to sell me twice, I said, my voice cold and hard. Now, Victor gets paid, and you get exactly what you gave me 15 years ago. Nothing. Victor looked at the ledger, then at me. A slow, respectful nod followed. "And what do you get out of this, Cassandra?" "I get a clean foundation," I said. "And I want a written guarantee that if Richard or Evelyn Vance ever set foot in this state again, or ever speak my name to anyone, you will consider it a breach of contract." Victor smiled. It was the smile of a man who recognized a fellow shark. "I think we can arrange that." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I was about to sign away their lives, just as they had signed away mine. But as the pen touched the paper, the front door burst open again. It was Mr. Sterling, the attorney. He was out of breath, his face flushed. "Cassandra, stop. You can't sign that. There's a codicil. A final instruction from Julian that was only to be opened if you were under duress." I paused. "What instruction, Marcus?" "It's not about the money," Sterling gasped, holding up a small black USB drive. "It's about the fire. The real reason for the fire." The room froze. My hand, poised over the paper that would decide my parents' fate, hovered in midair. Victor's men shifted their gaze from my father to the attorney standing in the doorway. Mr. Sterling looked like he had run a marathon, his chest heaving as he held that small black USB drive like it was a live grenade. "A codicil?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Marcus, I'm in the middle of a settlement. This settlement is based on a lie, Cassandra," Sterling said, stepping into the room. He ignored the glares from Victor's associates. He walked straight to the laptop sitting on the kitchen island and plugged the drive in. Julian knew Richard would try to blame him for the fire. He knew Silas Thorne would play both sides if he thought it would protect his own interests. But Julian kept one piece of evidence that no one, not even I, was allowed to see until this exact moment. Richard let out a shaky, nervous laugh. "What more could there be? I already told her. Julian provided the fuel."
He wanted the land. "Shut up, Richard," I snapped.
The laptop screen flickered to life. It wasn't a document. It was a video file, grainy and time-stamped 15 years ago. The camera angle was low, hidden behind some crates in the old warehouse. In the video, the warehouse is dark, but the moonlight is spilling through the windows. Two figures are visible. One is unmistakably my father, Richard. He's carrying a red gasoline can. But he's not alone. The other person is a woman. She's moving with a frantic, desperate energy, splashing liquid onto the stacks of inventory. It was my mother, Evelyn. The audio hissed, but then their voices became clear. "Are you sure about this, Evelyn?" Richard's voice on the recording was trembling. "If the insurance investigator finds out we did this ourselves, they won't." Evelyn's voice was sharp, a tone I recognized all too well. "Julian promised he'd buy the land after the claim is settled. We'll have enough to pay the syndicate and move to Arizona. But Richard, we can't take Cassie. If we take her, the syndicate will track us through her school records, her medical files. We have to disappear completely. Julian said he'd keep her safe. It's the only way we survive." I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice. My parents hadn't been manipulated by Julian. They had been the architects of the arson. They had planned to leave me behind not because they had to, but because I was an inconvenience to their escape plan. Julian hadn't started the fire. He had caught them in the act and used it to force them to give me up to someone who might actually care for me. The video continued. A third figure stepped into the frame. It was Julian. He looked younger, stronger. He was holding a digital camera, the very one recording them. "I have everything I need," Julian's voice boomed from the speakers. "The arson, the conspiracy, and the plan to abandon your child. Now here is how this is going to work. You are going to sign the guardianship papers tonight. You will leave tomorrow. If you ever come back, if you ever try to contact her, this video goes to the district attorney and the people you owe money to. You will lose your freedom, and then you will lose your lives." The video cut to black. The silence in the lake house was now absolute. I looked at my mother. She had collapsed back onto the sofa, her face buried in her hands, sobbing not out of regret, but because she was finally, irrevocably caught. My father was staring at the screen, his mouth agape, the bruise on his jaw looking like a brand of shame. Victor, the creditor, stood up. He looked at me, then at the pathetic couple across from him. "It seems," Victor said, his voice cold and clinical, "that my clients are even more disgusting than I thought. They didn't just sell you, Cassandra. They tried to frame the man who saved you. I looked at the unsigned release form on the table. The payment I was about to give Victor suddenly felt wrong. Why should they get a clean break with the syndicate? Why should I help pay off the debt of people who would have watched me burn, if it meant they could have a fresh start in Arizona? I turned to Mr. Sterling. Marcus, does the Judas Clause cover criminal acts discovered post-mortem? It does, Sterling said. And more importantly, the trust has a tarnish provision. If the beneficiaries are found to have acted with malice against the ward the trust is liquidated, and the beneficiaries are to be turned over to the authorities with all supporting evidence. I looked at my father, I looked at my mother. The little girl who waited on that porch for a car that never came back was finally gone. In her place was the woman who knew exactly how to demolish a condemned building. Victor, I said, my voice as sharp as a diamond, the deal is off. I'm not signing the release. Then I take my payment from them? Victor asked, a dark promise in his eyes. No, I said. You take your payment from the authorities. Because I'm giving them the video, the ledger, and the location of every offshore account Julian used to track your organization. Unless you want to leave this house right now and never look back? Victor's eyes narrowed. You're threatening me now? I'm giving you a way out, I said. The FBI is already on their way because of the silent alarm I triggered when I entered the house. If you're here when they arrive, you're part of the crime scene. If you leave now, you're just a ghost. Victor checked his watch. He looked at his men. We're leaving. He paused at the door, looking back at me. Julian Vance was right about one thing. You are a masterpiece. They vanished into the night. I was left alone with my parents and Mr. Sterling. The sirens were audible in the distance, a faint wail growing louder with every passing second. Cassie, please! My mother screamed, throwing herself at my feet. We're your parents. You can't let them take us. We'll change. We'll be a family. I looked down at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel revenge. I just felt finished. You said 15 years ago that I was no longer your daughter, I said. Today I'm finally agreeing with you. The wail of the sirens was no longer a distant hum. It was a rhythmic, pulsing roar that vibrated through the glass walls of the lake house. Blue and red lights began to dance across the expensive cedar beams, casting my parents' faces in a strobe light of impending judgment. My mother was still on the floor, her fingers clawing at the hem of my trousers. It was the closest she had been to me in over a decade, and yet the touch felt like a ghost's, weightless and cold. My father was backed against the wall, his eyes darting toward the back exit, calculating one last, desperate run for it. The back door is locked, Richard, I said, my voice cutting through his panic. I changed the security codes the moment I stepped inside. You're not running this time. You've run out of road. Cassie, look at us. Richard pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. We're old. We won't survive a prison sentence. Is this what Julian wanted? To see your own parents rot in a cage? Julian wanted me to be safe, I replied, looking him dead in the eye. He knew that as long as you were free, you'd be a threat to the life I built. He didn't put you in a cage, you built it yourself, brick by brick, starting with that warehouse fire. Mr. Sterling stood by the laptop, his hand resting on the USB drive, as if he were guarding the keys to the kingdom. The authorities are here, Cassandra. The lead investigator is a man Julian worked with for years. He knows the history. He knows what to do. The front door didn't swing open this time. It was commanded open. A team of officers moved in with practiced precision. I watched, detached and calm, as the senior partner version of myself took over. I stood tall, my arms crossed, while the officers moved toward the two people who had abandoned me at 13. Evelyn Vance, Richard Vance? The lead officer asked. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, and several counts of felony extortion. As the handcuffs clicked shut, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to signal the end of a 15-year-old chapter, my mother turned her head toward me. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. I wish we'd left you in the fire, she hissed. The room went silent. Even the officers paused for a split second, struck by the venom in her voice. I didn't flinch, I didn't cry. I simply leaned down until I was at eye level with her. That's the difference between us, Evelyn. You wish for destruction. I design things to last. And I'm going to make sure the memory of what you did lasts a very, very long time. They were let out, their protests fading into the night air. The house, once filled with the tension of their greed, suddenly felt hollow. The vultures were gone. The creditors were gone. Even the ghost of Julian felt like it was finally starting to fade into the woodwork. Mr. Sterling approached me, his expression softening for the first time. It's over, Cassandra. The trust will be used to pay for the legal proceedings against them, and the remainder, well, the remainder is yours. No strings, no clauses, no signatures required. I looked out at the lake. The water was still, reflecting the stars like a blueprint of the universe. I had my revenge. I had my justice. My parents were going to spend the rest of their lives answering for the 4 days they spent planning my abandonment. But as I looked at the leather-bound ledger Silas Thorne had given me, I noticed something I had missed before. There was a final page, tucked into the back binding. A small handwritten note from Julian, dated just weeks before his passing. Cassandra, it read. If you are reading this, the walls have fallen. You are now the architect of your own life. But remember, a house is only as strong as its secret rooms. There is one more thing you need to see. Go to the basement of the old firm's office. Look behind the original blueprints for the Sterling Heights project. You'll find the only thing I never told you. I felt a fresh surge of curiosity. The story wasn't over. Julian had one last reveal, one final piece of the puzzle that shifted everything I thought I knew about my own origin. Marcus, I said, turning to the lawyer. Do you have the keys to the old office archives? Sterling's eyes widened. The archives? Cassandra, it's nearly midnight. Whatever is there can wait until morning. No, I said, my heart starting to race. It's been 15 years. I'm not waiting another minute. I walked out of the lake house, leaving the luxury and the trauma behind. I got into my car and headed back toward the city, toward the dark heart of the Vance Empire. Because if Julian had a secret room left to show me, I needed to know if it held a treasure or another trap. The city was a graveyard of neon and shadows as I pulled up to the old Vance and Associates headquarters. The towering glass structure, which I had walked into 1,000 times as a protege, now felt like a giant silent witness. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble lobby floor, the sound echoing like a ticking clock. I headed straight for the service elevator, descending into the belly of the building, the archives. The air in the basement was thick with the smell of dust and blueprint ammonia. I moved toward the back corner, where the Sterling Heights files were kept. This was Julian's first major project, the one that put him on the map. I pulled back the heavy vellum sheets, my fingers trembling. Behind the framed original rendering of the skyscraper, there was a small recessed safe. I tried the code I used for everything, my birthday. 021, the lock clicked, the door swung open. Inside wasn't money or more blackmail material. It was a single silver locket and a birth certificate. I pulled the document out and held it under the dim overhead light. My breath stopped. Name of child, Cassandra Vance. Mother, Diana Vance. Father, Julian Vance. I sank onto a nearby crate, the paper crinkling in my hand. Julian wasn't my uncle. He was my father. Diana Vance, Julian's first wife, who had reportedly died in a car accident before I was born, hadn't died then. She had survived long enough to bring me into the world. The pieces finally locked together with a terrifying click. Richard and Evelyn hadn't just taken me in or sold me. They had kidnapped me. Richard was Julian's younger brother, a man who had always lived in Julian's shadow. When Julian's wife died shortly after childbirth, Richard and Evelyn, who were struggling with fertility and deep in debt, had stolen me and fled, faking my identity to extort Julian for years. The abandonment on the porch wasn't a tragedy, it was Julian finally finding me. He didn't buy a random child. He bought back his own daughter. He couldn't go to the police without Richard exposing the legal gray areas Julian had used to find us. So, he played the long game. He waited 15 years to ensure I was strong enough, smart enough, and powerful enough to destroy them himself. I opened the locket. Inside was a picture of a woman with my eyes and Julian's smile. On the back, it was engraved, "The masterpiece is finally home." I walked out of that basement and into the early morning light. The sun was just beginning to crest over the skyline, the very skyline I had helped design. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim of a story. I felt like the author of one. My parents, the people I called parents, were behind bars. Their greed had been their undoing, and my signature had been the pen that wrote their ending. I was Cassandra Vance, I was an architect. And I was finally free. If you found strength in this story of justice and reclaiming one's life, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to know that the truth always comes to light. And don't forget to subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab for more powerful stories where the underdog finally takes the lead. What would you have done if you found that safe? Let me know in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, never let anyone else draw the blueprints for your life.